My name is Peter Bart. My name is Peter Bartu. I'm a senior research scholar here at the Center and a lecturer in global studies. And it's my absolute delight to welcome to us today Professor Khalid Medani from McGill University, where he has dual appointments in political science and at the Institute for Islamic Studies. Professor Medani is here to talk to us on two important issues today. One is he's going to present his recently published book, Black Markets and Militants, Informal Networks in the Middle East and Africa, with a particular focus on Egypt, Sudan and Somalia. Professor Medani has kindly offered to also lead us through some of the key issues related to the breaking news in the region this week, which has been a coup in Sudan last week. And we're very grateful for you, Khalid, for agreeing to take that on as well. Professor Medani is going to speak for about 30 to 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions in the chat box. One thing I should also mention about Professor Medani is that he is an alumni of the Political Science Department at UC Berkeley, and we're delighted to have you back on home turf, Khalid. Welcome and over to you.
Thank you so much, Peter. I'm going to thank you by your first name, although it's a little bit informal, but I think we know each other pretty well by now. It really is a delight, not only an honor, but so exciting to be back at Berkeley, even if it is virtual. I spent many years in the political science department and in the Bay Area, of course, and a lot of the, as I was saying previously, a lot of the intellectual inspiration and ideas that I developed over the years really have come from the community in the Bay Area and from the University of California, Berkeley. So I'm so excited to see perhaps some students here as well. Hopefully some also from the political science department or who are focusing on the Middle East and Africa. I wanted to speak a little bit about this published book in a way that speaks to what I really would like to talk about and lecture about, and that is what is going on in Sudan. I'm sure many of you, and hopefully most of you, have been following the coup that happened Monday that has ousted or overthrown momentarily the kind of coalition or partnership between the civilian politicians and leaders in Sudan and the military establishment. It's a power sharing agreement that was established in 2017 through negotiations and an agreement in Sudan known as the Constitutional Declaration. A great deal of hope was pinned on this power sharing agreement that was supposed to transition the country to full civilian democracy and hopefully free and fair elections by 2023. So I do want to talk about some of the background to that. I want to talk about why that agreement fell apart, and specifically why these military leaders decided to topple this very tenuous kind of partnership between the civilian and military factions of the government, and what Sudanese right now are doing about it. This is a very timely time to talk about Sudan, because as I was saying to our host just before we got on, tomorrow is a very important day for Sudan and for Sudanese history. There is, for those of you who don't know, scheduled mass civil disobedience and protest in the Sudan, not only in the Sudan, but throughout the world. Protests are scheduled tomorrow in many countries in Europe, many countries in the United States, and rather cities in the United States, and also many cities in Canada, not to mention Middle East and Africa. We'll see how that transpires. So tomorrow, in protest to the coup, the Sudanese population in their millions throughout the country are going to try to reverse this military coup and return the country to civilian democracy. The major slogan right now in Sudan among activists is that there is no turning back. So I do want to talk about that in a little bit more detail and take questions about both the military coup and also the activists who are fighting for democracy. Before doing that, I wanted to plug this book that Peter was so nice to plug. I'm not going to talk about it too much. It's called Black Markets and Militants. And it really is a book that I began researching, or the idea came when I was at the University of California at Berkeley. And it really traces economic globalization and its relationship to the emergence of Islamic militancy and fundamentalism in Egypt, Sudan, and Somalia. And the argument is one that is a bit ambitious, but I spent many years trying to provide the evidence for it. And the argument is simply that these are three labor exporting countries where labor is one of the most primary exports, if not the primary exports, and more importantly, labor remittances, that is monies or funds, transfers of expatriate Sudanese, Egyptians, and Somalis to the Gulf countries in particular since the 1970s has represented the largest source of foreign exchange, hard currency for Egypt, for Somalia, and for Sudan. And I took many years researching and conducting field research in these countries to try to unpack what the effect this kind of transnational migration and the inflow of capital coming from the wages of these expatriate laborers had on local communities in Egypt, in Sudan, and Somalia. And the argument that is really at the very center of this book is that economic globalization in particular, that is the openness, the economic openness of the national economies to these kind of flows from outside are dependent, or their consequences are dependent, number one, on the variations in the capacity of the states to regulate these capital flows, that is to regulate these funds coming from expatriate laborers, and the social and cultural endowments of these different countries. And what I found over the years is, beginning in the 1970s, labor remittances and the way they were captured and monopolized by Islamist movements in Egypt and Sudan played a very central role in the emergence of what we call the Islamist economy in these countries. So in Egypt and Sudan have very important similarities in the sense that both countries have Islamist movements that profited a great deal from this transnational migration and the sending of remittances to their populations and communities through the establishment of Islamic banks and a variety of different Islamist-oriented financial institutions and welfare associations from which Islamist recruiters or leaders of the Islamist movement, specifically the Muslim Brotherhood movement or organization in Egypt and Sudan, was able to finance recruitment drives and popularize their movements. Obviously, there are other factors that popularize the Islamist movements in these countries, but I wanted to emphasize on something that was not and is not often really focused on, and that is the really kind of the economic networks, the economic commercial networks that make possible the rise and popularity of these movements. But I also, in the case of Egypt, for those interested in Egypt, looked at how this kind of flow altered the local economy of Egypt, and particularly the informal housing and labor markets in Egypt itself. Many of you probably know that one of the first really organized militant organizations in Egypt and throughout the world was Al-Jama'ah Islamiyah, that was focused first in the rural areas of Egypt and then in the urban areas, and particularly in a neighborhood called Imbaba that houses about 6 to 7 million residents. And I spent many months there researching with former members of this militant organization. And I found that the informalization of housing and in particular, the precarity associated with informal labor in Egypt was one of the major reasons that the rank and file members of this militant organizations joined these movements. So in the context of much literature that focused on ideology, and even foreign policy and foreign intervention in the rise of militancy, I focus really on the issue of economic livelihoods and how individual men, mostly men, responded to economic precarity associated with neoliberal policies in the case of Egypt. Finally, in the case of Somalia, I found something a little bit different because the cultural endowments of Somalia are different, of course, from Sudan and Egypt. For those of you who are familiar with Somalia, it's a wonderful place to visit, but it's also a place that is distinguished by being a country where livestock is the most important source of its domestic economy, and where clan and ethnic ties really supersede class and other forms of identification. And in the case of Somalia, what I found is that these labor remittances hardened inter-clan conflict and clan identity and solidarity, because these labor remittances were essentially channeled through clan networks, through these brokerage or firms in Somalia called hawalas. And so at a time when people were writing about Al-Shabaab as a militant organization, and Al-Ittihad in Somalia, also a militant organization that was really emerged simply out of poverty or foreign intervention, I really found that, number one, actually these informal financial transfers did not, as in the case of Sudan and Egypt, lead to militancy or Islamism, but rather to inter-clan conflict and clan solidarity. And I actually make this grand argument that this is the primary reason why the state institutions of Somalia collapsed. I go on to discuss in the book how these labor remittances and economic globalizations are affecting the fortunes of different experiments in state building in northern Somalia. So if you have an interest in economic globalization and its impact in the Middle East and Africa at the level of community, not just at the level of state, I hope that you will find this, this book interesting, particularly as it was inspired by what I learned at the University of California, Berkeley, and my friends there. And to this day, in fact, one of the endorsements is someone from one of my colleagues and friends from the University of California, Berkeley days. I shouldn't say that, but this is how much I'm indebted to Berkeley. Moving from this book, which was based on a comparative analysis, the present kind of book that I'm working on has to do with what is really important at the moment, and that is the aborted revolution in Sudan and the military coup. To begin with, maybe a little background on one of the most historic revolutions in recent times in the Middle East and Africa. I have given many talks on Sudan, not because I'm the most knowledgeable on Sudan, but because of the global interest in this revolution. And there's a simple reason for it, if for those of you who followed. In December 19, 2018, in a very small town called Adbara, a very famous town, however, in Sudan, in the northern part of the Sudan, something happened that was extraordinary. A small protest grew into a larger one and a larger one, first in the hundreds, thousands, and then millions, centered around the urban areas and then throughout the country. There was no one in this country who did not participate in one of the largest mass protests that the Middle East and Africa has seen. And the result was the toppling of 30 years of dictatorship and the leadership of the dictator General Bashir, that many of you may be familiar with, who is now in prison in Sudan and is awaiting trial by the International Criminal Court, indicted for crimes against humanity in Darfur, in the civil war in Darfur. Very, very serious business in that regard. Following the ouster of Bashir by these protests, specifically on April 11th, the coup leaders who have waged the coup this Monday did something that was a harbinger to what we see going on right now. And they basically tried to stem the tide of the revolution in Sudan by doing something that all authoritarian dictators in the Middle East and elsewhere do, and that is to try to manage a transition. What they did is that they ousted Bashir, declared that they were going to oversee a transition to a civilian government, and make sure that eventually a civilian government would rule the country. But instead, of course, what they were trying to do was to interrupt the revolution and sideline any kind of resistance or move towards a real civilian democracy. In response, Sudanese continued their sit-in, which they were inspired by the Tahrir sit-in of the Tahrir revolution, and did something that was even equally impressive. They began a series of mass strikes and civil disobedience in late May, following this kind of ouster of Bashir in April. And basically the country was completely shut down. a combination of different forms of civil disobedience were employed, led by a very famous organization, or rather well-known organization in the Arab world now, called the Sudanese Professional Association. This is a association that encompasses lawyers and doctors and engineers. And they formed an alliance and a group to coordinate these protests and acts of civil disobedience that included street protest, work stoppages, strikes, a variety of different forms of civil disobedience that actually undermined the plan or the plot of the military leaders at the time. In response to this civil disobedience, what the generals did in Sudan at the time was something extremely important, and I want you to keep that in mind when you speak to any Sudanese. And my Sudanese friends and colleagues, and particularly activists, always ask me to emphasize the June 3rd, 2019 massacre of young men, young women, girls and boys, 200 of whom were killed, many sexually assaulted and raped, others thrown in the Nile, a variety of different human rights violations that really speak to the mobilization and even anger of Sudanese activists today. The people responsible, it now has become crystal clear, are General Abdel Fattah Burhan, who is the leader of the present coup, and his ally, General Hemeti, who is the deputy of the Transitional Military Council, but even more importantly, the head of the Rapid Support Forces, which are militia organizations that played a central role in this massacre of June 2019. That was emboldened, and here is where external factors come into play. They were emboldened to do this by their alliance with the Gulf countries, particularly the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia at the time, and even Egypt. The idea was to, frankly, perpetuate the scenario that occurred in Egypt following the Tahrir Revolution. And that was kind of what was in the thinking. But what happened following the massacre was something entirely different from the Egyptian case, and that is immediate unanimous condemnation. After the African Union expelled Sudan from its organization, and quickly the United Arab Emirates and the Saudi Arabia and even Egypt, at the behest of the United States as well, pulled back in terms of sheer brutality and military intervention, and decided to form a coalition, or agree to form a coalition in partnership with civilian leaders, and particularly the opposition in Sudan, called the Forces of Freedom of Change. The opposition Forces of Freedom of Change that you may have heard of is essentially a coalition of political parties in Sudan, opposition political parties, the Sudanese Professional Association, a host of different civil society organizations, and very importantly, two very important youth organizations, one called Girifna, We're Fed Up, and the other called Sudan Change Now, very important youth activist organizations. They then formed in August of 2019, this arrangement that has now come down as a result of the intervention of the military coup, or as a result of the coup. It was a power sharing agreement that had three different elements. It's important to keep in mind. One was the establishment of a sovereign council, an executive council or executive body that would be composed of five representatives from the military, 5 representatives from the Forces of Freedom of Change, that is the civilian, and one prime minister to be agreed upon by both the military representatives and the civilian representatives. That prime minister ended up, of course, being Prime Minister Hamdok, who was ousted by General Burhan just this Monday, a very popular prime minister because of his background and a number of other reasons. So that was the arrangement. In addition to that, very importantly, there was supposed to be, at least according to the Constitutional Declaration, a rotational presidency. That is that the first 21 months would be, the Sovereign Council would be led by General Burhan, the military, and then he would cede power to the next president, who would be a civilian president, either Hamdok or another president of the Sovereign Council, who would be chosen by the Forces of Freedom of Change. I'll get back to that, the importance of that in terms of the timing of the coup itself in a minute. A third element, very important, was, of course, the establishment of a needed parliament, a legislative body. So that element was really important. And that was supposed to be scheduled prior to the holding of elections, first scheduled for 2022, and then now, of course, pushed to 2023. That legislative body or parliament has never been established. All attempts were interrupted by the interventions of Burhan himself. So the question then becomes, what happened to this arrangement that was supposed to peacefully lead Sudan to a democratic civilian transition? What happened to it was really interesting, and I think that most people are not fully aware. What happened to it was that it was undermined by, interestingly enough, a peace agreement called the Juba Peace Agreement that was signed on October 2020 by the Sovereign Council, particularly Burhan and even Hamdok, and two of the most important insurgent organizations in Darfur. One of them called the Sudan Liberation Army, led by Mini Manawi, another one, the Justice and Equality Movement, GEM, also an insurgent movement in Darfur, led by Khalid Jibril. That becomes a very, very important kind of watershed at the beginning of the joint, of the breakdown of this agreement. Why did this agreement cause the unraveling of this kind of arrangement? It had to do with, in December of 2020, Burhan did something that he thought was very tactical and was supposed to sideline the civilians. He established something called the Transitional Military Council, and he essentially changed the rules of the game. He changed the arrangements that were agreed upon by the Constitutional Declaration in August of 2019. And what he did was he gave a greater representation to these two insurgent militia organizations from Darfur in two important ways. He added an executive, another president or representative that would happen to be the brother of General Hemeti, who's his deputy for Transitional Council. And he allowed for 25% of the representation of the ministerial portfolios to go to these two insurgent organizations. In addition to that, he was able to co-opt some additional representatives from the Forces of Freedom of Change, particularly from the Sudanese Professional Association. From this moment, you could see that he was intent on holding on to rule. He was intent on undermining the executive authority of the civilian government and the Prime Minister Hamdok himself by essentially utilizing this Transitional Council to veto any items on the agenda that the civilian wing of the government under the leadership of Hamdok would try to implement. This becomes a really important kind of watershed. The idea was to gradually erode the power of the civilians and, in a relatively peaceful way, utilize his partners, these two insurgent organizations, in order to perpetuate and militarize and consolidate military rule. Two problems occurred. One of them is two of the more important and insurgent organizations on the borders of South Sudan and also in the province of southern Kurdistan refused to sign this peace agreement. So he didn't have all of the insurgent groups in this transitional council. Another one is a little bit more complicated, and that had to do with the relative success of Hamdok and the civilians opening up Sudan to the international community. In other words, improving the relationship of Sudan to the international community. That they did through financial liberalization. They did it, of course, by working with the Americans and, of course, with the Israelis to lift Sudan from a list that's the America's list for states that sponsor terrorism, and in general open up move Sudan away from its historical pariah status especially in the international community and the West. They forged good relationship with the Europeans, with the African Union, and of course also with the United States. That becomes really important and gives you an idea why so many countries and organizations have condemned this military coup. So what was the choice for Burhan? How in this context would he take over the country. Well, he tried another tactic that also borrowed from the Egypt scenario, and that is in September 21st, to test the level of opposition. There was an attempted coup in Sudan that he headed and masterminded that was aborted. It did not receive that much protest and mobilization at the time because the majority of Sudanese knew that it was a fake coup, that he was essentially testing the waters to see the level of opposition he would have for a military coup. That's very important. From then on, you could see that this military coup that occurred on Monday was at least 6 weeks in the making. First, testing the waters to see if there's going to be mass mobilization against an attempted real coup. And another way that he did that was to orchestrate and finance so-called opposition to the civilian military partnership in conjunction with his allies from the Sudan Liberation Army and from the Justice and Equality Movement. And what he did is basically orchestrate protest in front of the army headquarters with people calling for the disbandment of and dissolution of this government and actually asking Burhan to take over power, that the country was in chaos, the economy was in distress, and there is the potential of a civil war, and therefore the only solution was a military one. Now, the mistake in the calculation here was that unlike in Egypt and elsewhere, the vast majority of Sudanese at this historical moment are opposed to a general and military government. And what happened only a few days after this so-called, these protests calling for General Burhan to take over, where Sudanese started protesting, organized by the Sudanese Professional Association, first in the thousands in Khartoum, against the potential of a military coup. And then most would say in the millions as these protests really expanded throughout the country. Basically, activists across the social society spectrum signaled immediately that they knew that Burhan was intent on a military coup, and they themselves signaled that they were not going to stand for another military government, and that becomes really important. So that background, I think, is important because it gives you an idea of the steps towards this kind of consolidation and control, and that is a really important background to what happened on Monday. What happened on Monday, as Peter knows full well, the catalyst for that was the visit of the United States Special Envoy, to the Horn of Africa. I'm talking too much. The Horn of Africa, who visited Burhan and Hamdok and agreed on a specific time schedule to oversee the transition to civilian rule. But specifically, by November 17th, I'm told, basically Burhan was supposed to give up power to a civilian leader. That, of course, would have meant that all of the agenda associated with the civilian wing of the government and the will of the Sudanese people would be implemented with full authority under civilian government. And that, of course, would undermine the interest of General Burhan and the military. That was the catalyst that explains the timing of this particular coup. The very next day, within, I think, 24 hours, basically Burhan went and kidnapped Hamdok, disbanded the civilian government and cabinet, not only at the national level, but also the appointed governors in the regional states or the governance provinces. And so that was clearly a military coup, which is really important. But there are two factors that explain the desperation of why Burhan basically decided to hedge his bets and, take a risk essentially by intervening and having a military coup instead of, overseeing or the government or the country to civilian rule. The first had to do with the issue of accountability. Of course, as you may know, not only was Bashir indicted by the ICC, Burhan and Hemeti in particular were responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths in that war. And excuse me, let me just get some water. So the threat of indictment was really an important issue. The idea being that if Bashir and his cronies are taken to The Hague and tried, that they would expose, of course, the war crimes, not only of Burhan, but in particular Hemeti, his deputy. That's one of the important aspects of why this coup occurred. Another one is even more important, and I try to emphasize it because I think many people who don't follow Sudan closely are not always aware of a very important committee that was part and parcel of the Constitutional Declaration, a committee called the Commission for the Dismantling of the Institutions and Remnants of the Previous Regime, or the regime of Omar Bashir that took over in 1989. This commission essentially was tasked with dismembering what those of you who study the Middle East know full well, the deep state. All of the institutions, particularly the financial institutions that are linked to the army. We don't have specific, verifiable estimates, obviously. It's very difficult to come by, but upwards of maybe 60 to 70% of the economy is controlled in some way or fashion or another by the military. And what this commission was tasked to do under the Constitutional Declaration, and of course, really something insisted upon by the Forces of Freedom of Change in Sudan, was to take to task not only the companies, military companies that were involved in the economy and monopolized certain sectors of the economy, but also specific individuals for their corrupt economic practices and for their use of the state for profit. So specific names, in particular from members of the now banned party, the National Congress Party, and most of whom were originally members of the Islamist movement in the country. This saw a great deal of progress. A number of companies were actually dissolved. People were indicted already, although they were up for appeal. Many of those names are not only linked to Burhan and Hemeti, but many would argue would implicate directly these two individuals for not only war crimes now, but economic crimes also that would basically allow them to be convicted under the civilian courts in Sudan. So the issue of accountability for human rights violations and the issue of corruption, but not corruption in a small sense, really large corruption would be important. A very important example I'd like to emphasize, perhaps the most important that people now are fully aware of, is the gold sector in Sudan. The gold sector in Sudan is the most important source of revenue. It is makes up approximately $1.2 billion dollars in exports for Sudan. Sudan is the third largest exporter of gold in Africa, in the entire continent. Most of that is smuggled to the United Arab Emirates and marketed and sold there. And the majority of those mines, gold mines, and the trade is monopolized by none other than General Hemeti, who happens also to be the head of the militia, the Rapid Support Forces, that essentially at this moment are enacting an unbelievable level of violence against peaceful protesters. We now know there may be upwards of 40 killed, although it's far more than that, most likely. It is maybe about 400, 500 seriously injured, detentions, tortures. Young people in particular from these different youth organizations are being imprisoned and detained. All of this in the lead up to tomorrow's mass demonstration. You can see the videos of the small clips that are coming out from Sudan in that regard. So the issue of dismantling the deep state in Sudan is not a small one. It is directly related and implicates, so this commission and its work has implicated General Burhan, and I would like to emphasize in particular Hemeti, many of whom believe is responsible for plotting the coup. And of course, it's directly linked to external actors as well and their economic interest in Sudan. So this is by way of explaining what is the catalyst for this coup that occurred on Monday, but equally important, what are the essential aspects or the reasons for this decision on the part of General Burhan. In the aftermath of this military coup, what we see are a couple of things that were unexpected and what Burhan did not calculate. The first one was such an immediate condemnation internationally. Remember, what Burhan has tried to advertise is that this is not, incredibly, that this is not a military coup, that it is simply reforming the revolutionary process, and that he wanted to save the Sudan from chaos and from civil war and even racial divisions, and that he is going to oversee a civilian government as long as, of course, he appoints these civilian leaders. It's, of course, a camouflage to signal, his cooperation, or rather that it's not a military coup, to the international community. It's not only Sudanese in their millions, who do not, of course, believe that by any means, but now it seems the international community didn't buy it either. First, you had the European Union condemning this military coup, followed by the United States. The list went on, the United Nations. And then, very importantly, at the behest, I would argue, from the United States, the African Union went as far once again to expel the Sudan from the African Union, saying that their membership is now contingent on a return to a process that would lead up to a civilian democratic transition. This kind of international condemnation is not something that occurred so quickly when the revolution, or the first iteration of the revolution, began in 2018. That's the external part of the story. The domestic part of the story is interesting. One of the questions that asked, of course, and very important, and as I conclude this lecture or this talk, has to do with the response in civil society. The question, of course, is that can this revolution be salvaged? Will there be a return to the possibility of civilian government? And I would argue that yes, absolutely, because what is happening, one of the reasons I rehearsed the lead up to this coup on the part of civil society actors is, number one, the mobilization in opposition to Burhan has been going on for months, not only in terms of rhetoric, but also in terms of the mass mobilization already that had occurred and organization. Just as an example, by Monday, before the internet was cut by Burhan, already the coalition in civil society had organized a variety of different scheduling of the protest leading up to tomorrow's mass protest. They had also sent instructions before the internet was cut to activists throughout the country to utilize social media and their phones in ways that people like you would understand what's going on in the country, and to link up with Sudanese in the diaspora like myself. This all happened the same day of the coup, because already activists had mobilized in preparation for the coup that was to come. In addition, every single political party has condemned the coup, and that has led Burhan into a difficult situation, because he is unable, at least at this moment, to find any kind of party or constituency of any kind to co-opt into this so-called rectifying a government or reformist government that he's trying to build. He has been forced by most accounts to go back to the Islamists, that many of whom are in prison or are waiting court and trial, to see if he can get remnants of the Islamist movement and the National Congress Party to be part of his government as a way to actually form a government. To this, at present he hasn't been able to form a government of any kind. That becomes a really important part of the story, the organization, mobilization, and insistence that Burhan has now committed a crime against the nation in obstructing the move towards civilian rule. And increasingly, unanimously, I would say, particularly among the civil society organizations, the trade unions, professional associations, and the resistance committees, there is no appetite for rehabilitating a partnership between this military and civil society. Hamdok has been now asked or through mediation what his conditions would be to return to be prime minister. And at the behest, of course, of the opposition in Sudan, he has said that there has to be, number one, no involvement on the military, particularly these individuals in terms of as part of the government, and there has to be a separation between the military and civilian. More specifically, military forces have to be then brought into under the authority of the civilian leadership. And of course, most importantly, the release of all detainees, political and non-political, who have been opposing this regime. These are three very, very important conditions that are very important. Finally, the last part of the equation in terms of the question of will the revolution continue has to do with the role of external actors. We spoke about the United States. They are now considering, in addition to condemning the government and revoking a small amount of money, relatively 700 million aid package. There, from what I gather, there are now the administration in Washington, D.C. is looking into other more stringent options to sanction Burhan and play an important role in returning the country to a transition of civilian democracy. And most importantly, of course, are the regional countries. It would be, I would be remiss, to say the least, if I did not mention the three important powers in the region that have great interest in Sudan: Egypt, United Arab Emirates, and Saudi Arabia. I would argue, for many of you, of course, know the interest of these countries in the region and in Sudan as well. This kind of anxiety and fear of a democracy and democratization that would somehow influence their own populations and the region and cause instability. In the case of Egypt, of course, they have two concerns. One of them, of course, is a democratic Sudan that would influence and undermine the rule of Sisi in Egypt. At the same time, they are, concerned about the possibility of Islamism in Sudan because they have taken a strong position against the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. There are financial linkages that are far more than most people who don't know Sudan and the region realize. Billions of dollars of linkages between the Arab Emirates and Sudan, specifically in terms of the gold markets and other commodities, which is really important. There is a great interest on the United Arab Emirates with respect to the port on the Red Sea, which of course is extremely influential, not only economically, but financially. That becomes a really important aspect. Egypt is very, very concerned and anxious about the Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia and would very much like a reliable military ally such as Burhan, from their perspective, to oversee and be on their side with respect to the talks and associated with the Nile waters. And Saudi Arabia has been, at least in recent years, interested in Sudan, and less for economic reasons than it has been with respect to the utilization of soldiers from Sudan that Burhan and Hemeti basically brought in or paid to fight Saudi Arabia, the Yemen war on the side of Saudi Arabia, before Saudi Arabia decided to plan an exit option from that country. I would like to conclude on this external dimension, which is important, is that I believe that there is movement there, that just like that there was following the massacre of June 2019, by which I mean that there seems to be an understanding among many, and I think discussions that, and I would argue that the Burhan, number one, and Hemeti do not necessarily represent reliable partners for these countries. That's number one. Number two, the sheer popular mobilization and unity and cohesion and insistence, or rather refusal to accept this military government on the part of Sudanese makes Sudan and civil society in Sudan, frankly, exceptional. That is something that is not familiar to Gulf leaders, that this is a country that actually will continue to be unstable, not like other countries, and that Burhan and Hemeti will not be able to deliver the so-called stability that they perceive to be in their interest. And that argument is increasingly, I believe, gathering steam on the part of external actors who are mediating. And what we hear now is that the United States is in close talks with the Gulf countries with respect to this kind of intervention. And so I would argue that whereas in other cases, military leaders promise stability and even peace, and just as Burhan is trying to promise his regional allies, that the sheer force, mobilization, and will of the Sudanese people to return to the principles of the revolution that saw the martyrdom and killing and detention and torture of thousands and millions of Sudanese. I think that that is a really important aspect. One important additional element is that the two largest insurgent organizations in Sudan have also condemned the military coup, which means that not only would this military regime not be able to have stability or create stability in Khartoum, they won't be able to even end the civil war in the country. And that, of course, undermines not only the interest of the United States, but I would argue, and we can debate it, I could argue that this undermines the interest of the regional actors as well. Let me stop here. I know I spoke a great deal, and then take questions, or we can have a discussion as well.
Fantastic. Thank you, Khalid. I feel like we've all been given a ringside seat at an unfolding drama, and you've brought a granular knowledge on almost every single aspect of it. Just simply extraordinary, and thank you so much, both for the book, which is excellent, by the way, and then for this second part, which, as I said, is just riveting. So for the audience out there, you can put any questions you may have in the chat, or to pass on your thanks. And we could even take human voices at some point. But let me start off with just a couple of questions while I wait for other questions to come in. Khalid, if people and the students and myself we want to follow this story, certainly what's happening tomorrow and beyond, what is there a particular source that you would recommend for us all to get the best and latest news as to how this unfolds?
To be quite honest, Peter, at this juncture, the best source, your students will get this more than I do, are really the Twitter feeds and the Facebook pages. So hashtag Sudan coup is really, really important. It's also, to be quite honest, these are hashtags we are told to give you guys. So hashtag Sudan coup, and I'll send you a number of other Twitter accounts that's really important. It's important because the information that I just gave you really has come from these activists themselves, and they report there is hashtag SDSPA. Hashtag SDSPA. That's the Twitter of the Sudanese Professional Association. And they have both English and Arabic because they know there are people throughout the world who are interested. And from that Twitter, you will see, they will tell you what they're organizing for, what their demands are, and they'll give you analysis of why they're opposed to the coup.
Great, terrific, thank you. Khalid, so just checking I've got a first question coming in here from Ezgi, and then Ibrahim. So from Ezgi, the question is, have civilian representatives and leaders in Sudan made any commentary concerning the gold transactions? And, has that issue been brought to the forefront in any way? And then a second question. Thank you for your eye-opening remarks. The question is about General Burhan aiming to be a Sisi-type character and the multiple parallels between Sudan's revolution and that of Egypt. The question is Hamdok I think he's former IMF economic technocrat, as polarizing a figure in power as Morsi was in the Egyptian case. So just to recap, is the gold issue central to the civilian disobedience issue, and how does Hamdok compare to Morsi?
Yeah, yes, thank you, Izgi. It's one of the recommendations of the United Opposition, particularly the Sudanese Professional Association and the Forces of Freedom of Change. So one of the conditions is to sanction those traders in gold, particularly Hemeti. So there's a real acknowledgement that gold and the gold trade in particular is financing these militias and in other words, making possible all this violence. So it's extremely important. Now, it's also important to give you just a quick background, and that is that the gold in Sudan, the majority of which it's actually smuggled. It goes into the informal economy. And this is another reason for the intervention of the coup, just to give you an idea of why your question is so important. The civilian government had been very successful in regulating some of this gold trade, forcing traders to put a particular amount in the central bank. And essentially over time, they siphoned 30% of this trade into their central bank. In addition to that, the commission that I talked about, a number of the mining companies that were linked to militias the gold companies were simply dissolved. So that commission that I spoke to you about undermined the relationship between the militias, and particularly Hemeti, and the gold industry. And they were threatening to undermine it even more because gold is so important in terms of revenue generation for the state and central bank. And that was a way to meet the inflation issue and some of the social economic issues. So that has been central. It's not always talked about because Sudanese know it intuitively almost, but I can assure you that it's clearly one of the recommendations to the international community that there should be sanctions not only on the side of Sudan in terms of Hemeti, sanctioning him as a war criminal and stopping his trade, but also having serious discussions with the United Arab Emirates to talk to them about the importance of bringing the gold trade in line with international standards. That does not necessarily undermine the economic, windfalls and trade for United Arab Emirates. But cutting these middlemen out and regulating this trade is extremely important for a variety of reasons, and it could really forestall and undermine these militias. In terms of the comparison with Sisi and was it Morsi and Hamdok? I think that's the central question. I mean, that's a question we're asked all the time. This is absolutely a copycat. I can show you some, if you are familiar with Egypt as I am, you will see the videos coming out of Egypt that are by independent journalists and comedians that are actually literally comparing Burhan's speech to Sisi's speech. I'll send you those if you want, for those of you who know Arabic. And absolutely a carbon copy in terms of the discourse and of course the plotting and the planning. The difference is what you mentioned, and I know Sudan well. There are lots of chapters on, I know Egypt well. There are lots of chapters on Egypt in this book, by the way, on the Islamist movement. What the difference is exactly what you said. Hamdok is not a polarizing figure. Morsi was a polarizing figure because that question of the Islamist movement versus the non-Islamist in Egypt was not one that was really tackled and dealt with by the Egyptian population, primarily because, as you know, the Muslim Brotherhood were historically, for many years, in general, in opposition to the Egyptian state. In the case of Sudan, the Islamists were in charge of the state. So Sudanese had 30 years, 3 decades to unravel the issue associated with Islamism and their relationship to a very narrow economy. And in the case of Sudan, their sheer brutality. In the case of Egypt, the Muslim Brotherhood had, on one hand, the advantage of being in the opposition, and Egyptians did not have an advantage of interrogating the full kind of contours and motivations of that Islamist movement. And of course, the Islamist movement in Egypt is very divided. Long story short, Morsi was polarizing and was able to be polarizing because A, he was utilized by Sisi to be such, but B, because the secular Islamist divide in Egypt continues to be one that is unresolved. In the case of Sudan, right now, the protesters are chanting that Burhan Jabul Kezan. In colloquial Arabic, that means Burhan was brought by the Islamists. See the difference here, a clear opposition and intellectual work. And I'd like to think that this book and this kind of work was part of it, been doing it for 30 years, that is to excavate the political from the religious in the Islamist movement in Sudan. It was done effectively in Sudan, not yet in Egypt.
Great. Well, we've got some fantastic questions coming in. Let me just, I've got a really big one myself, actually, while I gather my thoughts, but this often during transitions in general, before I take a couple of other questions from the chat, Khalid, is this, how do you, the economies generally are very vulnerable during these transitions. And it's certainly been the case, I think, in Sudan's transition, that, the economy hasn't improved, shall we say, through this. Could people have done things a little bit differently in terms of supporting the economy through that critical time to actually, remove that as an excuse for mobilization against the transition is the first one. I know it's a big one, but if you could take that one. Then we have another question in terms of back to the book, your thoughts on the Hawala system and how whether these were monopolized by Islamists in the Egyptian context also. So two economic questions there. Why don't I just leave it at that for now, and then I'll come back after you've answered those.
Sure. Yeah. Well, there are many mistakes that the civilian wing of the government made, of course. Most importantly was divisions within the civilian government. That, frankly, that was to be expected. As I was saying in another interview, ironically, well, not so ironically, the military intervention resolved those divisions, because all of a sudden you had to have all the political parties, all the civil society groups, all the movements and organizations to unify. So that's, I think, is really important. They did make some mistakes with respect to the economy. It's interesting. That would be the general kind of understanding. But it's as someone who's definitely a political economist, it's very important. I also like to think of myself as a researcher. And for the majority of Sudanese activists, they insist that this is not a revolution of hunger. This is a revolution of politics. This is a revolution of 3 decades of brutality, millions dead, tortures, prisons, and deep, deep corruption, of course, at the big states. I'm not saying that economic grievances don't play a role, but what we've seen really is, we would not have such unity across social class with private sector workers and public sector workers going on strike if there wasn't a real revulsion against militarism that has really bedeviled and undermined the fortunes. Sudanese have been, interestingly patient in terms of that, with the full expectation it was going to take some time. I'll give you an example. Because of that, the inflation was stabilized, although it's ridiculous, and there were policies that curbed the black market, at least in ways that allowed for the dollar to slow down a little bit in relationship to the Sudanese local currency. But to give you a good idea of why grievances were not enough, Burhan was counting on it. The discourse initially was that this government is not going to bring you food or wealth or whatever. And then he decided to orchestrate the blockage of the Red Sea port in Sudan, to basically starve the Sudanese, and then say, and I didn't say that part of the story, it's a bit complicated, but every Sudanese activist knows, and every Sudanese knows that he's the one who orchestrated. He utilized an ethnic so-called ethnic leader to block the port. And that, of course, stopped in the wheat and commodities for Sudanese, particularly even the middle class. That was a way to actually try to make economic grievances an excuse for him to intervene. It didn't work. That is one way to answer your question. The political here becomes more important than the economic. In terms of the hawala, in the case of Egypt, or what we call al-qita' ghayr al-munazzam, the informal sector, or tujar al-umla, or the currency traders, that's a complicated story. That's why I wrote the whole book, because it's at certain times and for certain reasons, it's monopolized either by formal institutions, that is the state, and other times by the Islamist businessmen. And so there is this kind of dynamic relationship in the case of Egypt. The state sometimes allows for the deregulation of these transfers because they serve in Egypt, because they serve as a social safety net. They did that throughout the 70s and 80s. And in the book, I describe why they did it, why Sadat and Mubarak did that, and their administration. And then I describe in the latter chapters, in the early 1990s, why the Egyptian state would essentially come down hard on these hawalas, on these informal channels. One has to do with economic reasons, which were very important. It was part and parcel of economic liberalization and neoliberal reforms. That's the economic side of the story under Mubarak, in particular in the latter years. Another part of the story really was the threat of the Islamist businessmen. I'm sure you've heard of Khairat al-Shatir and the Islamic institutions. For many decades, they were given essentially carte blanche to rule an informal financial sector in Egypt, and fought back hard and struck back against them by regulating them and by imprisoning some of the major leaders of the of the Muslim Brotherhood. In the case of Somalia, the state just did not have the capacity of the strong Egyptian state to do it. Siad Barre tried to do it, but by the time he attempted to regulate, just to give you an example, by the time Siad Barre attempted to regulate the hawalas like Mubarak did, there were no banks in the country. They had all collapsed. There was no central bank, no financial institutions, and the state was too weak to regulate these. So hopefully you'll read the book and see some of the details of that.
Hi, Khaled. I asked for Peter's permission to just perhaps follow up. I had a look at the book. Congratulations, first of all. It's wonderful. And it's really impressive and intellectually stimulating. I'm Egyptian, and I actually went to McGill, so I'm really interested in your work, and I'm reading it and enjoying it. My question has to do with hawalas in the current context under Sisi, and I wanted to just follow up with you. If you have any observations or thoughts on the current situation, because it seems to me that labor migration in Egypt has continued to go on quite strongly in the last few years. So following the revolution, it's picked up in terms of contributions to the GDP. And all this money, it makes sense to use hawalas rather than to use the formal banking system from the perspective of expat labor. So how are they sending money home? Is the crackdown on Islamists means that the new hawala companies are linked to the state? I'm just wondering on your thoughts for that. Thank you.
Initially, as you know, particularly from Egypt, of course, they were very much linked to the state in the earlier period, and the state used them, as I described, as a very important part of the social safety net in the context of economic liberalization. In the case of Egypt, because it's a stronger state, the labor migration, I have to speak to some Egyptian friends, but the regulation has been very strong. As you know, as an the Egyptian government has had historically a very astute way of regulating these flows by having a variety of different foreign exchange bureaus and different foreign exchange transfers. But in recent years, from what I know at least, and I have to update myself, is that Sisi has been able to, or at least his government has been able to keep inflation down low enough that the majority of Egyptians do send those those expatriate remittances back home through formal channels. Now, when that becomes a problem, what the Egyptians do, the government does, which is not something that's not the other countries are unable to do, and that is when there are moments when the Tujar Shanta or Umla begin to emerge in Egypt, and that is when very craftily the Egyptian government does then allow for different types of currency exchanges and different tiers, so to speak, to encourage labor migrants. But right now, I think that it's basically the deregulation of these financial markets that don't give an incentive for Egyptians to utilize the black market. And that is what I'm seeing now. That's the economic part of the story. The political part of the story, I think, is that historically they really understood that was going to be profitable for people potentially opposed to the regime. And what Mursi did in his administration, if you read the book, they really wanted to go back to expanding the black market in order that they could monopolize it. And so those lessons have been learned by the Egyptian government, which is different from the other cases.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Khaled.
Thank you, Khaled. So do we have everyone in the audience? Do we have any more questions that you'd like to field with Professor Medani? So I don't have any more coming in. Khaled, you've spoken so comprehensively against so many things. There is one question that quickly popped in. Has there been an increase in weapons sales, and then which I don't, Gabe Gonza, I've seen that question. I'm not quite weapon sales from whom to whom, but let's one from El Sadiq El Sheikh asking, one of the things about the transition in Sudan has been this normalization of relations with Israel, and how do you see that being impacted, if at all, in the context of the potential coup?
Sure. I can't tell you the number of Arabs, Palestinians, and others who texted all of us to ask about normalization. Some jokes and some incriminations as well. Yeah. What is the role of Israel? It is far more important than people think. I think that for many who thought that Israel and its interest in Sudan was peripheral, it's really clear that it's not. One of the reasons it's historical, the post 1967 war, the three no's of the Arab countries really were based in Khartoum and Sudan. They came from Sudan. So Sudan has always been part of that definitely anti-Israel or anti-Zionist coalition in the Arab world. And also they've been a bridge to Africa, which is a great market and very important for Israel's economy, which is really important. What you guys perhaps, there are two aspects of Israel. One of them, of course, is the United States and Trump at the time. And so to lift Sudan from the black countries that support terrorism, basically it was a form of blackmail. There was that was the condition to do it. Now you can argue that Hamdok and Burhan at the time should have said no, but I don't think that Hamdok had that kind of power. Another thing is that Israel's relationship and normalization with Sudan is really a proxy way for the Arab Gulf countries to normalize with Israel and to use Sudan as a third party, so to speak, in that sense. So they've been very interested in that as well. A normalization would have been threatened, according to the Israelis, not even to me, by a civilian government. If you look at the newspapers in Israel, senior officials in Israel have supported Burhan very clearly. They're very honest about it. They feel that he is the best partner to continue with the normalization. And they fear, rightly so, that a civilian government that is civilian and also democratically elected would revoke normalization, because remember, this is not a representative government. So this is what we're seeing now. There are also economic interests among Israeli companies in the country as well. But I think that this security aspect is really, really important. And there's a question about Tunisia, I think. I don't know.
There was a question about Tunisia, yeah. It's, this is the very good from Aisha as well. Can you give us your comparative thoughts on the role of civil society in the Tunisian and Sudanese transition and how they might compare?
Well, I mean, I haven't conducted, I've been to Tunisia, I haven't conducted research there, but I have a wonderful PhD student by the name Marwan Mukawar from Morocco who wrote on it, and it's a really great book, and he teaches at York, and his argument and the many of Tunisians is the comparison is clear in terms of the strength of civil society. But I want just to remind everyone that when we talk about civil society, it's an overused concept and not really useful. In both countries, the strength of trade unionism is extremely strong. It's deceptively strong in Tunisia because people didn't expect that the trade unions and the lawyers unions would have such an important coordinating role. That's the same in Sudan. Trade unions continue to be very, very important. The professional associations, just like in Tunisia, are very, very important. And the final thing, believe it or not, relatively, by Arab terms, relatively more developed, despite what's going on in Tunisia, developed political parties. One of the things about Egypt and other countries is that, as opposed to Tunisia and Sudan, and a little bit in Morocco, the strength of political parties are very, very important. The reason I mentioned that is that in all of these transitions, for Aisha who asked, coordinating civil society for an uprising, for democratization is quite different from consolidation. So I would suggest that when you're comparing these countries, to compare them in terms of networks in civil society that, like in Tunisia and Sudan and in Egypt, that are able to topple regimes. And that's going to continue, by the way. We now know that these protests are going to be persistent throughout the Arab world. It's a form of politics now, permanent politics. But what's really important is for consolidation. And it's not so much fun to research in the Arab world, but we have to do a little bit more research in terms of the political party strength and the levels of different political parties, the extent to which they're linked to the state, how autonomous they are from the state, and of course their internal democratic kind of composition, because that's a way to answer what's going on in Tunisia right now, I think.
Thank you, Professor Medani, Khaled. That's been a tour de force of not just Sudan, but the Gulf and the wider Middle East.
But you have Al-Sadiq al-Sheikh here.
Oh, yes, I do.
Why don't you have Al-Sadiq take us away?
Okay.
If you don't mind, because I knew there would be some Sudanese here, and I think that I want to just, if you wouldn't mind, because this is really a moment for us in Sudan, all of us, all Sudanese, and all Arabs, of course. So
wonderful. El-Sadiq, are you there? Can you join us?
Yes. Brilliant. I can top what Khalid says. I mean, this is the most comprehensive talk I will ever imagine to hear it in 40 minutes about the whole entire situation in Sudan. But before that, I want to just say one thing about your book. I didn't read it yet, but I've been following. You are one of the most amazing scholars who really track the financialization of those movements, especially Islamist movement in our part of the world, but in the wider North Africa and the Middle East. And that's extremely important to understand the political economy of any country, especially in Sudan, how the financial interests actually perpetuate most of the political instability. I can't top what you're saying, but one thing I want to maybe share with the students of Peter, that the most important things I think outcome of this military coup is the consolidation of civil society forces. It's not wishful thinking, but I'm extremely optimistic that this military coup cannot last because it doesn't have any leg to stand on, doesn't have the internal support or external support, despite some governments they might want to see. However, my fear is it has to do with with the outbreak of unrestricted violence. That's the fear, and that's the tactic often the last resort that they might be used by the leadership of Hemeti and Burhan. But no, thank you so much, Khalid, and this is really a juicy stuff for anybody familiar with Sudanese politics to be exposed to. Thank you.
We want to thank people's interest worldwide, especially in Arab countries. I cannot tell, it's really interesting. The bravery of Sudanese youth, and of course, emphasizing the violence is so important. This is why we're here today, because we all predict and we know, I didn't want to detail what is happening right now, but it's really, so any help in that respect, and we've been asked, there are actually flyers telling people how short the video clip should be and who to send it to, and they send it to people like us so we can send it to you. So that is a really important form of mobilization. Another thing is really that the burden of these young Sudanese, not us, not me, but is also a regional one. They understand full well that other young Arabs and in the region are looking to this experiment. It's very important for it to succeed because it has ramifications. What the whole countries in the region know full well, that its success has huge ramifications for all of the regional countries, all the Arab countries.
Again, I think on behalf of everybody, Khalid, Professor Medani, thank you so much for your generosity, your time, your extraordinary knowledge that you shared with us today. And we will do what we can to support your people and wish you, we'll be watching this very closely moving forward.
Thank you very much. And bye, everyone. What a pleasure. Bye.
Thank you, Khalid.
Thank you.